Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, a lot of us are watching what's going on in the United States very closely. This week, I had an interview with a lawyer about Trump's civil litigation in New York. I think what happened in South Carolina is interesting. We got Michigan coming up, and so I thought it would be interesting to check in with a professor who's written a book about what Canada is going to be like and what Canada is going to be impacted by post a Donald Trump win. Kim Nossal is a professor emeritus in the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University, and he's written this book on how Canada will be affected should Donald Trump win the 2024 election. Professor Nossal, welcome to the show, sir.
Well, it's great to be here, Brian. Thank you very much for having me.
And please remind me the name of your book.
The name of the book is Canada Alone: Navigating the Post-American World.
Navigating the post-American world. So this is an America that's a different America post Donald Trump, you believe?
It's if in fact Donald Trump wins the election in 2024, then indeed we're going to be in a very different world. The post-American world is essentially a reference to the transformation that the world has undergone in the last number of years. Basically, the American world was the American-dominated international system from the end of the Second World War in 1945, probably all the way down to the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022.
You think the world has changed from an American-dominated one, or one that was led by America, to something different post the Ukrainian, the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Essentially, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 marked a huge transformation that was already underway. I mean, essentially, what we have seen since the beginning of the 21st century is the efforts of the two great powers besides the United States, the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, essentially challenging American dominance and doing so fairly successfully.
So what you're effectively
we saw with the rise of Donald Trump was essentially a challenge to American leadership and American dominance that paradoxically came from within the United States itself. Mr. Trump had essentially nothing good to say about American leadership, and he moved quite dramatically in his 4 years as president between 2017 2021 to essentially withdraw American leadership. Now, Mr. Biden, Joe Biden, when he was elected in 2020, reversed that. But if we see Trump reemerge in 2024, we're going to see a return to that abandonment of American leadership. And that's what puts us, or will put us, very firmly into the so-called post-American world.
So in 1989 or 1990, when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, you're effectively saying it's the end of American history in 2024.
Well, I mean, Francis Fukuyama had this idea that essentially with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that essentially history, as we had known it during the Cold War, had come to an end. Of course, that proved to be in the event, that proved to be dramatically wrong. And what we've essentially seen is history keep on going. What we are seeing now is the end of the kind of American dominance that we saw in the 1990s in particular.
So why is it that you think that Trump is going to have this such profound impact? You know, he was a mercantilist. He was a very ardent nationalist. He, demanded Canada renegotiate NAFTA into the, what is it called, the Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement or something like that. He came strong down on China. Wasn't that American leadership?
It definitely was an American attempt to assert a certain kind of dominance. But it wasn't leadership in the sense that if you looked at what Trump did in his first term as president, what he did was abandon all of America's followers, including countries like Canada, like American allies in Europe, American allies in the Western Pacific. The United States going off and barging around as Mr. Trump did is by no means leadership. And as it turns out, of course, Mr. Trump and his singular lack of understanding of the contemporary global international economy meant that Americans lost big time, or bigly, as he would no doubt say,
Bigly.
because essentially it was Americans who ended up paying the huge tariffs that he imposed on all sorts of friends, allies, and, as in the case of the People's Republic of China, adversaries as well.
So one of his most quoted quotes from the last couple of weeks has been a comment that he supposedly made to a head of a NATO country, saying that if you don't pay your way equal to the 2% of GDP, he's going to encourage Russia to do whatever they want with you, and he's not going to protect them. So what do you think Trump would actually do in a second presidency? Do you believe he would destroy NATO or tear it apart and allow Russia to attack somebody?
I think all you have to do is to look at what Mr. Trump has promised us that he will do. He has promised us that he will bring the war in Ukraine to an end within 24 hours, he says. And I don't doubt that. All he needs to do is to have one telephone call with Vladimir Putin, and that would essentially be the end of the Ukrainian struggle against the Russian Federation.
By doing
We've
what?
already seen what
Giving
sorry?
By how? Giving away territory and cutting off
Oh,
Ukraine?
absolutely. Look, the United States right now, because of the Republican majority in the House and the failure of the Republicans in the Senate, the United States has essentially stopped meaningful aid, military aid to Ukraine. And Mr. Trump has left in absolutely no doubt that was very much what he wanted to do. After all, it was he who called the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and told him to abandon those legislative efforts to find a way to get American military assistance flowing to Ukraine. This is what he wants, and he's told us this for years. Since the 1980s, he has let it be known that he thinks that NATO is obsolete, that NATO is filled with a bunch of other countries seeking to rip the United States off. His favorite verb is that these countries are raping the United States. And so that I don't have any doubt at all that were he to be president, one of the very first things he would do is abandon Ukraine and force essentially the Ukrainians to basically bend to Russian will. The only thing that might save it, the only thing, is if the Europeans end up basically abandoning American leadership and essentially forming their own united effort to help the Ukrainians continue regardless of what the Americans are doing.
What else would he do? Would he do
Well,
things with the IMF or the
that's
United
the very
Nations?
first thing. The second thing he would do is follow through on a promise that he made during his first term, that he said he would do during his a second term, and that is essentially withdraw from NATO. And that would be easy for him to do. All he would have to do is use his executive authority as president not to appoint a single American officer to NATO headquarters in Brussels. He could use his authority as president to withdraw all of American troops presently assigned to NATO operations, simply bring them back to the United States. He doesn't have to renounce the North Atlantic Treaty of April of 1949 to withdraw from NATO. Keep in mind what the French did in the mid-1960s was essentially to withdraw from the O part of NATO, the organization part of NATO. They remained signatories to that 1949 treaty throughout that period when they essentially didn't participate in NATO. I could see that President Trump could do exactly the same thing. But even if he does nothing, very simply the kind of message that he left in Conway, South Carolina, back on the 11th of February, which is, as you say, but you left out an important word, he would encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they wanted. And it's that particular phrasing that leaves in no doubt at all what his particular approach to the North Atlantic Alliance actually is.
Pretty scary. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Professor Kim Nossal and talk a little bit more about his book, about his understanding of former president and potentially future president Donald J. Trump and what he would do to the world, to the end of American history and American leadership in this world, and also obviously to us in Canada and what the implications are for us here. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saturday Night 60. Really interesting and a little bit scary conversation with Professor Kim Nossal today. He did his PhD at the University of Toronto in the 1970s. He's taught international politics at McMaster University. He went to Queen's Political Studies Department, Queen's School of Policy Studies over the course of the next 30 years, retired in, 40 years actually, retired in 2020. He's been president of the Canadian Political Science Association. He has an honorary degree from the Royal Military College. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and he's an author of numerous books on Canadian foreign and defense policy, including Charlie Foxtrot, Fixing Defense Procurement in Canada, and Canada Alone, Navigating the Post-American World 2023, which is what we're talking about tonight. And that is what's Canada going to be doing in a post-American world. Professor, we were talking about NATO. So number one, that he's effectively, Donald Trump, you're thinking, going to be a modern day Neville Chamberlain and going to Munich and giving half or more of Ukraine to Russia. And I guess appeasement didn't work once, but we'll try it a second time. And then withdrawing from NATO. What else do you see him doing that is the end of the American world? He's made negative comments about the United Nations in the past, about the IMF. What else would you see him doing?
The withdrawal from NATO is just simply one part of what I think is a larger project on his part, on the part of this thing that is called America First. America First is a movement, it's a set of ideas about essentially withdrawing the United States from the kind of active engagement that it's had for the last 80 years in international politics. And so that means, for example, revisiting what he was doing from 2017 to 2021, when he moved quite methodically to withdraw the United States from a range of international organizations and international agreements. He withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, a trade agreement. He withdrew from the Climate Change Accords. He withdrew from the World Health Organization. In other words, what he's essentially going to do is to pick up where he left off when he was defeated in 2020. And so what we're going to see is very much it seems to me, the end of what political scientists call global governance, the process by which the 200 odd governments in the international system come together to negotiate and work through global problems, problems that no one country alone can actually solve. And that is something that I have no doubt at all he will just simply start to do again.
Now, America has had eras of isolationism previously, have they not? How did that work out, and how did they ever get out of that?
Well, the primary era of isolationism was from the end of the First World War until the early 1940s, when essentially the United States, even though it was a great power, uh, essentially withdrew from global politics. And as so many historians note, it didn't work out well for the United States. Essentially, the US was forced in 1941 by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and then the German declaration, the Nazi declaration of war on the United States. The United States was essentially forced into the Second World War, despite the efforts of another movement, also called America First back then, to keep the United States out of the global conflict. And so the argument frequently is today that a similar move towards isolationism by a Trump administration or by any other America First Republican president would essentially not end well for the Americans either this time, that they would be forced back into global politics.
Is this a Trump effort, or is it wider than that? You know, some people are calling part of the Republican Party, or at least the Republican Congress, to be the Putin wing of the Republican Party. There's a significant amount of isolationism within the Republican Congress right now, is there not?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that we need always to keep in mind is that American politics is always about more than just simply one individual. Mr. Trump is essentially reflecting a considerable degree of antipathy in the United States to that kind of global engagement. There's a reason why when he stands up on a platform and sneers at the Europeans, that he gets a huge wave of applause. His views might not be the views of every American, but they certainly are the views of tens of millions of Americans. And we need absolutely to take that on board.
Why? Where is this sort of isolationism and nationalism and American first kind of attitudes come from? When, as you said, since the 1940s, America's been this leading light. This wasn't it wasn't it Reagan who called it something like the shining city on the hill?
Yes, mirroring a long string of sort of American mythology about how exceptional the United States is. But here's the thing: the American leadership that every Republican and every Democratic president down to Mr. Trump in 2016, 2017 had engaged in was extremely useful for the United States. American interests were very well served by the extension of what essentially was a global imperium by the US. The problem is that many Americans were simply not convinced that their interests were well served. In particular, I think because of what was widely seen as the failures of American engagement, in particular in Afghanistan and Iraq. And here is where individuals do make a difference. Mr. Trump has a particularly idiosyncratic view of how the global economy works. You used exactly the correct word to describe him. He's a mercantilist. And he simply does not have any sense of how international trade can actually be mutually beneficial. His view, and he's expressed it on numerous occasions, is that anyone who trades with the United States is essentially raping the United States. It's a bizarre view. It's as though he never read any Adam Smith, or has no understanding at all of the idea of comparative advantage. And yet that's very much his view. And so that when he stands up and he accuses others of unfair trading, of raiding the United States, of raping the United States, of being unfair to the United States, people listen, and they've bought into that particular view.
Is Donald Trump good for American business?
Absolutely not. And generally speaking, overall, very simply because when he proposes the kind of tariffs that he's proposed, he goes around calling himself tariff man. And so, for example, he wants to crank up a 10% across the board tariff for everything that comes into the United States. Likewise, in his efforts to do battle with the Chinese, with the People's Republic of China, he has actually floated the idea of imposing a 60%, that's 60% tariff on goods coming in from China. This, if he were able to actually implement those ideas, the impact on American consumers, first of all, would be huge. I mean, people love their iPhones, but if an iPhone costs $4,400 rather than $700 or $800, people would begin to notice. Likewise, American business, in particular those businesses that depend on international intercourse, would find that they would be very badly done by such tariffs. And here's the problem. Mr. Trump imposed a whole bunch of tariffs in his first term. If he did that again in his second term, others in the international system would absolutely impose tariffs on American products coming into their countries. And that leads, unfortunately, to the kind of beggar thy neighbor approach to international trade that we saw in the early 1930s, and all of the huge economic costs that imposed.
After the collapse in 1929, wasn't there a global trade war where tariffs were raised worldwide?
Oh, absolutely. And indeed, in the Canadian-American case, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that the Americans imposed on trade from Canada led to huge economic losses on both sides of the border, but in particular on Canada. No one benefits from that kind of trade war. And yet, if he becomes president, we can just simply assume that trade war is coming. He's surrounding himself with fellow mercantilists who share his essentially idiosyncratic view of international trade.
So I'm sorry, sir. If we've got this example that appeasement with Chamberlain didn't work, if we've got this example that isolationism in the 1920s and 30s didn't work, if we've got this example that a global trade war in the 1930s, created or at least deepened the Great Depression, why has he got these policies?
Well, in large part because he knows nothing about history. He is aggressively ignorant about the world, and we're seeing what happens when tens of millions of Americans celebrate that ignorance and embrace it and enthusiastically promise to vote for him.
There's also something about democracy that I went to my master's degree in the United States, and I remember at the time thinking that it was the shining city on the hill, and it was a beacon of freedom, of democracy around the world. And really, it's almost as if it's now a beacon of autocratic strongman, um, right wing, isolationist, populist politics.
It indeed, but it will depend heavily on how Americans end up voting this November, and how many of the 240 million or so Americans who are eligible to vote, how many of them show up to vote. Keep in mind that in 2022, of that 240 million, 120 million Americans simply didn't show up to vote. Some of them because their votes were suppressed, in particular in Republican-led states. But the vast majority of those who didn't show up to vote simply didn't show up to vote. They couldn't be bothered. If in 2024 we see large numbers of Americans come out to vote, and if large numbers of Americans vote the way Americans have traditionally voted, generally speaking, then what we're going to see is perhaps the defeat of the movement towards authoritarianism and autocracy and illiberalism that is deeply embedded in today's Republican Party. And so that a lot of the future depends heavily on that voting pattern in November.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Kim Nossal about Canada after the election of Donald Trump. Again, if that was to happen in November of 2024, the professor is the author of a book called Canada Alone: Navigating the Post-American World. This is a pretty scary conversation, sir, because he's currently the leading candidate to be the nominee of the Republican Party, and based on most polls, he could actually win.
I think that we need to be just a little careful about what the most polls actually indicate. While Mr. Trump has a plausible path to victory in November, it's by no means assured. I mean, we're at the beginning of March, and November is a long way away. And the polls that are so often cited that show that Mr. Trump is beating Mr. Biden, I think we need to take them with a huge grain of salt. First of all, Mr. Trump is facing 91 felony charges that are going to be adjudicated sometime this year. He likewise has a real problem in raising money compared to Mr. Biden. And the Democrats really haven't started a full-scale attack against him. Keep in mind that we're dealing here with a person who is going to be the presumptive nominee. But watch what happens when the Democrats start moving against him in a serious way. Keep in mind, what we've got here is Mr. Trump as an adjudicated rapist. And all you have to do is to think about how easily the ads write themselves when you've got someone who has Mr. Trump's record out there. And so that I think that we need to be scared, yes. We need to absolutely prepare for the worst, but I'm much more hopeful. I'm much more optimistic.
Well, I'm glad you are. I got to tell you, for this sentenced rapist, as you described.
No, an adjudicated rapist. It's important. It's important to reflect that he was found liable, and that the judge referred to what he was liable for as rape in any other way. So yes, an adjudicated rapist, not a convicted or a sentenced rapist.
Okay, I apologize. An adjudicated rapist, and I presume a adjudicated fraudster. That evangelical Christians still support in a huge majority. And I just find it astounding that anyone that calls himself Christian could support such an individual. I do business in the United States, travel to the United States quite frequently, and there's a lot of people that are just like you and me that support Donald J. Trump and support him fervently. And I'm amazed by it. Anyway, we've got to take a break. We got to take a break for message, and we're going to be back in just 2 minutes with Kim Nossal. And we're going to switch, and we're going to say what's the implication for Canada, and what do we need to be wary of, and what do we need to be prepared for, and what the heck should we be thinking about doing? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. What an interesting conversation tonight with Professor Kim Wassel, Nossal, I apologize. He's a professor emeritus in the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University. He's written a book on how Canadians will be affected should Donald J. Trump win the 2024 election. His book is called Canada Alone, Navigating the Post-American World. Sir, I presume one can get that on Amazon or other good places where books are sold?
Absolutely. Your independent bookseller or from Dundurn Press online? Absolutely.
Excellent. I look forward to reading it, sir. Let's change just a little bit the topic and ask you, given this, what's the road ahead for Canada? What should Canadian leaders, political leaders, and business leaders be thinking about?
Well, I think that what we have to do is to recognize that, like everyone else in the world, Canadians can't do very much about what's happening in the United States. We essentially have to sit and watch the unfolding of American politics. And as we have for our entire history, we'll deal with whatever Americans serve up to us. However, there are a couple of things that we are going to be affected by. One is there's absolutely no doubt that we're going to be affected by what can be called the sort of the Trumpification of Canadian politics, the movement north of some of the elements of Trumpism into Canada. We've already seen some elements of that. All you have to do to get a sense of what this is going to look like is to look at the preview that we were given with the so-called Freedom Convoy in early 2022. That movement very much represented a kind of a northward flow of MAGA politics. And so one of the things that we're going to have to basically alert ourselves to and to call out, in essence, is the appearance of MAGA politics in Canada. And that's something that ordinary Canadians can do, but it's also something that our political elites in the media and in the political parties can help themselves and help us as well. So that's the kind of the effect of a kind of a northward flow. But there's going to be other things that we need to prepare ourselves for. One is the possibility and the probability, actually, of an attack on Canadian American trade. And for that, we're going to need to do what we did in 2017-18, and that is to what the government at the time called the all hands on deck approach, which was essentially to try and defend Canadian interests in the United States by essentially working around a White House that was quite antipathetic to Canada. And we're going to have to do that again. And to do that, we need to think imaginatively about how to get into the United States, to talk to Americans in state houses across the U.S., in state governments, in both houses of the federal Congress. And that's going to require that we think about what our relationship with the Americans is going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years.
So let's break those two different issues down if we could. Some people think that Pierre Poilievre won the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. Some people have described it as a takeover by the trucker convoy, that there were hundreds of thousands of new members of the Conservative Party. Certainly, the supporters of Jean Charest would argue that it was a whole bunch of new supporters that were extremely right wing, extremely um, the supporters of the trucker convoy that made the difference in his leadership campaign. But yet today, it looks like he could win the most resounding majority in Canadian history, comparable to almost a Diefenbaker 1950 something or other majority. Isn't that the MAGA taking over?
Uh, I think that what we have to do, we will have to wait and see. Mr. Poilievre is, if nothing else, too smart a politician to know that if he were essentially to appeal only to that relatively small group of Canadians who love going around with their MAGA hats on, that he's not going to win. He's got to appeal to a much more broad-based centrist group of Canadians. And if you listen to him, I would suggest that he is very aware of that. Now, the fact is that the Conservative Party, there's no doubt that they are concerned about uh, drawing away support from Bernier's People's Party, and so that we can see a bit of footsie going on. And certainly, I think in 2022 we saw that. But as the election campaign unfolds in the next year and a half here, it seems to me that Mr. Poilievre will reveal much more about what kind of conservative politics he's into.
The Conservative government did not support Canada or Ukraine free trade agreement. Some people think it was because there was a little bit of this isolationist attitude within the Conservative Party, and they did not want to be as supportive of Ukraine as the federal Liberal Party has been. Um, when you think about who could actually stand up stronger to Putin, who do you think it's going to be?
Well, I think unfortunately, we haven't heard from Mr. Poilievre what he thinks of Ukraine and how to resolve the problem of military assistance. Uh, the Conservatives voted against that free trade agreement on an absurd premise, the premise that it forced a carbon tax on the Ukrainians, which is just, well, it's a bizarre way of interpreting that particular article, and the Ukrainians have said as much. And so what we need to hear from the Conservatives is, do they want a Russian victory in Ukraine? And it seems to me, they need to be quite clear, as clear as at least as Americans when it comes to this question. There are lots of Americans who like to fudge on the issue of when they are asked directly, do you want a Russian victory in Ukraine? And they fudge because they have to fudge because their party leader does not want a Ukrainian victory. I have to put the same question to Mr. Poilievre.
Chrystia Freeland got a lot of credit for leading the efforts in the last negotiation with Donald Trump and his White House on the Canada, U.S., Mexico free trade agreement. Do you think that Pierre Poilievre would do as good a job as Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau did, or would it, because their politics are similar, be weaker for Canada?
That's a good question because I mean, essentially, when you throw open a huge agreement like the old NAFTA was to negotiations, you basically open what might be thought of as a can of worms, and it depends very much on your particular negotiators how those worms are wrestled to a final agreement. Yes, Ms. Freeland was exceedingly successful, but there's no question that if it were Mr. Poilievre's responsibility to negotiate for Canada, I would have no doubt that he would do as creditable a job in defending Canadian interests, just simply because, if nothing else, he would have exactly the same group of experts behind him that Ms. Freeland had behind her, Canada's international trade bureaucracy.
We're chatting tonight with Professor Kim Nossal from Queen's University, who's written a book about Canada and the United States after a future potential victory in the November 2024 U.S. election by former President Donald J. Trump. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes with Kim Nossal. Stay with us, everyone. This is really interesting. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've really enjoyed chatting tonight with Professor Emeritus Kim Nossal, Emeritus Professor at the Center for International Defense Policy at Queen's University. He's written a really interesting book called Canada Alone, Navigating the Post-American World, which is about what the world is going to be like post-American leadership in the world if and when Donald J. Trump wins presidency back again. I got to ask you, as we're chatting about Canada and the United States, sir, former, I think it was head of the Canadian Defense Forces, General Rick Hillier, this past weekend said that Canadians are irrelevant on the world stage today. Is that part of the problem?
It is a serious difficulty that Canadians have run themselves into, in large measure because so much of our foreign policy over the last decade or so has been what some have argued is just simply a kind of performative foreign policy that is full of statements and of rhetoric, but very little hard action. And part of the reason for this is that Canadian governments for the last 20 years or so have been exceedingly hesitant to spend on international affairs what we need to spend on international affairs if we want to be taken seriously in global politics. We don't spend enough on defense. We don't spend enough on our diplomacy. We don't spend enough on development assistance. Instead, we love to spend as little as we can get away with. Some people call this free riding. It's actually not free riding at all, because we actually do pay a considerable amount. But what it is what Joel Sokolsky, a colleague of mine at the Royal Military College, has called easy riding. Canadians love to spend as little as they can on global politics. And that has a consequence. And the consequence is we're not taken seriously in international affairs the way we could be if we started putting stuff out there and putting stuff up.
We've only got a minute or two left, sir. In your book and in your analysis, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I have to be optimistic about the possibility. I'm as I've already said, I'm optimistic that Americans who have voted in particular ways in 2018, 2020, 2022, that Americans will continue that, regardless of regardless of what the polls show, that they're going to continue that in 2024. Whether or not the United States is able to reassert its former leadership in international affairs, that's more problematic. And I'm not so optimistic about that. But in terms of the possibilities of the United States not falling into a full-scale Trumpist presidency, I'm optimistic.
What a fascinating conversation tonight. Really thank Professor Kim Nossal for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Kingston, Ontario, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.